everybody. We are going to go ahead and get started here. It's just turned 2 o'clock. So I am currently sharing my screen, and welcome to today's Forum Conversations webinar. Today we are going to be talking all about the process of migrating from MDID into Forum by looking at a recent project with Vanderbilt University. So I am Hannah Marshall, and I'm from the Forum team, and I'm joined on today's call by two people. The first is Shelby Merritt, who is the Visual Resources Curator at Vanderbilt University. So Shelby oversees all of the collections and systems at Vanderbilt that we're going to be talking about today. And then Erin McCall is the migration manager for JSTOR Forum. So she's the lead on all of our migration projects, and she is my beloved teammate. So Shelby and Erin, you can both say hello, and sort of we're going to try and introduce ourselves so you can tell our voices apart throughout the session, but no guarantees.
Great. Hi, everyone. This is Shelby Merritt. As Hannah said, I'm the Visual Resources Curator at Vanderbilt University.
Hi, and I'm Erin McCall, and I'm the Migration Manager for JSTOR Forum.
All right. So today we're going to be talking about the migration of Vanderbilt's art history image collection, which was being migrated out of MDID and into Forum. And that whole project took place kind of during the late summer, early fall of this year. So it was pretty recently completed. And anybody on the call who has participated in a migration project probably knows that there are lots of people that are involved on both sides. But Erin and Shelby, you guys were really the project leads for your respective organizations on this project. So, and I know that you worked really closely together kind of throughout the summer. So you struck me as the perfect people to talk to about migrations today, because this one is probably very fresh in both of your memories. I also, part of the reason for today's session is that migrating an image collection is one of those daunting projects that almost every person who works with visual resources or digital collections will eventually have to deal with. And I think it's really valuable for people who may be considering one of those projects or kind of staring one down to hear about different ways that a migration can unfold, and especially to hear about examples where it went smoothly and it had a successful outcome. Obviously, every migration is unique. Every collection is different. Every combination of systems is different, but there are definitely benefits to looking at best practices and sort of sharing what worked well from one project to the next. So that's a little bit of what we're hoping to get at today by just kind of talking through this project and what it looked like and what the priorities were. So before we jump into the actual nuts and bolts of the migration process, I wanted to start off by having you both introduce yourselves a little bit and talking about your respective roles. So I thought we would start with Shelby, who can kind of fill us in on visual resources at Vanderbilt and talk a little bit about your role specifically.
Sure, yeah. So we, the Visual Resources Center, are in the History of Art department at Vanderbilt University. And we provide a variety of services to faculty members and students to a lesser extent. Image digitization services, teaching support. We do digital humanities tool teaching for undergraduate students. I occasionally teach workshops on digital humanities tools and any other sort of like visual resources adjacent needs for history of art, and to a lesser extent, more broadly on campus. So we also service the classics department, occasionally religious studies, history, and then we work closely with the library on certain projects. So we do a bunch of stuff. I wear a lot of hats, but sort of the core of the Visual Resources Center is our digital image collection, which has been in a number of databases over the years. Most recently in a homegrown database called Dimly, which we'll get into a little bit later because it's sort of confusing. And then slightly earlier than that, MDID, which is where we migrated this data from. And so this collection is mostly copy stand images, so copied out of books, from some other print materials. Every once in a while, we will do some original materials. I was just recently working on digitizing some 18th century engravings. But I would say 95% of the collection is copied materials or images from vendors, particularly from Archivision. About 60% of our total number of images are Archivision images. So I manage the database for that in whatever form it takes. I do a lot of cataloging. I also have another counterpart staff member who does a lot of cataloging. And we use undergraduate student workers to do some copy cataloging, but in a supervised environment.
Mm-hmm. So when you said before that you've worked with some original content, you mean like locally held physical collections that you guys are digitizing?
Yeah, and that's pretty rare. The example I gave, these engravings are owned by a faculty member, but they go into the collection with everything else. Although generally in the data in the source, it will indicate that there will be some data that indicates that it's more original material than copied, like everything else is.
Yeah, do you guys have like an imaging studio as part of your unit where you can photograph physical objects, or did you just sort of repurpose the equipment for the copy stand when you did that project?
We generally repurpose the equipment for the copy stand in the few projects that I've worked on since I've been here. We have a bencher copy stand. The platform for it isn't that large, but it can accommodate fairly large documents. For these engravings, there were only a couple of them that I needed to do in pieces and sort of stitch together later on. But yeah, so we have a typical copy stand setup with just a single overhead camera. We ingest those into a Mac where we do the editing in Lightroom and then do some image resizing in Photoshop with an automated script. It gets backed up to a library server and then now ingested into Forum.
All right, that sounds like a pretty well-defined workflow at this point.
It's pretty straightforward.
Yeah. So I'm curious, in the collection that you guys have, this sort of massive library of images for art history and teaching, are there particular strengths that are represented within that collection, or do you guys sort of focus on areas based on the specialization of your faculty, or what's the sort of collection development that goes on there?
So in the past few years, we haven't necessarily done any proactive collection development. It's generally just on an ad hoc basis what faculty members need, what they bring to us for digitization, which is a lot, but it's not really organized in any particular way. But it has happened over the years that it's fallen out where certain faculty members request a lot of images because their particular fields don't have high resolution images available elsewhere. And so over time, our collection has developed strengths in those areas. One being, we have a faculty member who teaches primarily Chinese and Japanese, but also other Asian cultures, Buddhist and religious architecture. And she has tons and tons and tons of field photographs that she's taken over the years during her research. And that's, of course, not actually copied material, but those are her original photographs. It's a really strong collection. And then she brings a lot of Chinese and Japanese book materials for us to copy images out of. So I actually think that is a resource that's not widely available in other collections, and that's really important for her to have. And then the other strength, I think, is strangely and very differently Mexican modernism and Mexican mural art. So Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo and their sort of social circle in that time period. We have a faculty member who has written multiple monographs on that topic, and he constantly orders images for that.
Okay. I actually noticed that when I was poking around in the collections, that it's particularly strong in that area.
Like hundreds of Frida Kahlos.
Yeah. And I feel like that's always the value of these art history teaching collections, is that they can develop these sort of unexpected strengths that are kind of a nice reflection of the expertise of the faculty and staff in the department as well at any given time. And then they obviously provide this really important supplemental role to any other resources you guys are using. So one of the things that's obviously, like, based on that overview of your role and the work that the unit does, one of the things that's clear is that in addition to having a static and existing library that needed migration, you also have ongoing work that you need to be doing in whatever system you're using. So I would imagine that factored pretty heavily into the migration process, right? That you've sort of had to, there must have been a window where you had to freeze doing new work while you migrated the collection before you picked back up, right?
Yeah, that was something I thought about at the beginning of this migration. We started this process really in the summer, and it's very, very quiet here in the summer. There's not usually more than one class being taught in any summer session, so we don't get a lot of digitization orders, luckily, at that point. So it was okay during the migration itself, but as soon as we launched Forum in September, I had 3 or 4 digitization orders roll in, and I needed to be ready for those as quickly as possible. So, and it still has worked out that we're doing a little bit of work in our old system as far as our digitization workflow goes, and then we have moved about 90% of our workflow into Forum at this point for new orders.
All right, that makes sense. Okay, so then I wanted to sort of hand it over to Erin. Erin, can you talk a little bit about your role as the migration manager for Forum?
Sure. So historically, I've always been an implementation manager, which we are experts at Forum, and we work with new subscribers to get this training they need in order to be able to devise workflows and come up with strategies of working with their content as if it were new. Sometimes there are movements of small collections into Forum, and we assist with that. But this was an experience moving into the more migration manager role, in which it was moving a large collection of content into Forum and assisting, Shelby and Vanderbilt to get that up and running so that she could start working on her workflows right away. And so as a migration manager, I sort of help project manage and set expectations for the timeline of getting the work done, assessing the work and getting it mapped into a new project in Forum, and making sure your fields and all of your data is treated with respect, and that it carries over as perfectly as possible, although perfect is sometimes difficult to achieve, but just cleaning it up along the way, and then importing the images and publishing it out to your preferred destination. And in the case of Vanderbilt, it was an institutional collection for students and faculty to start using right away.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think can be really daunting about a migration like this, and where I think having support from a designated migration manager like you, Erin, is that it's not just porting a bunch of content from one location to another. You're also having to move like all of the workflows that go with managing and creating and delivering that. So you also have to mimic all of those processes that existed in previous systems and either update them or just purely recreate them in the new one. And so that's where having somebody with a lot of expertise in the system is additionally helpful, because you're also there to kind of weigh in on those decisions as well as they get up and running.
Yeah. And I think we were lucky with Vanderbilt in that, like, the workflows were really thought out by Shelby. And so it made the conversations of making that transition very easy to have, I must say.
I appreciate that you think that.
And what better way to spend a summer, right, than migrating content, and reworking workflows. Okay, so that, I feel like that's a pretty good portrait of kind of who each of you were in this process. So I thought we would talk a little bit about, there are 2 main sort of spheres of this project that I want to talk about. And the first is the existing landscape that was at Vanderbilt, which you guys were moving away from, but like some of the history to those platforms and the way that those shaped your priorities in deciding to migrate, because obviously, like, there are things that every system does well and that are important to you, and you want to bring those things with you. And then we'll sort of transition into talking about the actual process and the main sort of touch points throughout that. So can you tell us, you sort of alluded to dimly being complicated before, can you sort of paint us a picture of what the MDID Dimly landscape was like at Vanderbilt before?
Sure. So the Visual Resources Center had a long time physical slide collection, which they finished digitizing in about 2010, as my counterpart Faye tells me. And so it went into several different systems over the first couple years, but eventually around maybe 2010, 2011, 2012, Faye moved it into MDID, which was the main collections management system for a long time, and that was the main access point for both faculty and students. And at some point, they had a staff member in the Visual Resources Center who was interested in doing application development and wanted to build a homegrown collections management system and database for the images. That is Dimly. So that was developed in-house, and we used that for about 2013 on. The big difference between MDID and Dimly being that MDID was a flat database and Dimly was relational, in the sense that we had a work record and then image records nested underneath it. It had very dynamic relationships between objects in the system, Getty references, so it was linked to Getty vocabularies. It was very robust cataloging. However, the user access end of the system was never really fully developed, and our workflow became such that a faculty member would order some images, we would digitize them for them, we would deliver them in their preferred method, be it PowerPoint or the original TIFFs or JPEGs, deliver that to them directly, and then do the cataloging from the book in Dimly, do really good, robust, complex cataloging, and nobody would ever look at it again because there was just no user access point for Dimly. So, and there was a weird time period where things were being originally cataloged in Dimly and then shuffled back over to MDID, which meant flattening out that good relational data back into the flat MDID schema. And that the MDID data is what ultimately got migrated at this point, although we anticipate doing a second migration step that we can maybe talk about a little bit more. But yeah, so that was sort of what became of the workflow, and a major concern for us was not only faculty access, but like student access. So the question, sort of the philosophical question, was why are we doing all this really great cataloging if no one other than the Visual Resources Center staff is looking at it? So we wanted to move to something that didn't require as much staff upkeep on our part for just the development aspects of it, where we could really focus on access and getting people to use it.
Yeah, how were faculty members who were submitting the image requests even being able to use those in their teaching then, if there was no access being?
The majority of them just requested PowerPoints generated.
Okay.
Yeah. And so they would use the PowerPoints, you know, they would pull stuff in and out of them as needed, switch them up for classes. I assume they have some sort of like local file management system that varied from faculty member to faculty member. And like we had maybe 2 or 3 faculty members who were brave enough to get into the Dimly system, but what they saw was what the cataloger saw. It was very much the back end. So there was no separation of an interface between the cataloger and the end user.
Right, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so then MDID was being used when you mentioned that you were shuffling the data from Dimly back into MDID and flattening it out. That was out of a desire to deliver it somehow, somewhere.
Exactly. It was just sort of a stopgap measure to try to get some access to it for people outside of the brave faculty members. Because it really is, I mean, I do believe that Dimly was really good. It is really good, rich catalog data, but it's just, if no one's going to see it, then it's sort of a moot point.
Yeah, there's, I feel like I've heard this sentiment echoed in a lot of tech services departments, which is you don't want to be sitting on metadata you can't use, and you can't use metadata you don't have. And it seems like you really don't want to be creating a whole bunch of really rich data and then not being able to take advantage of that or deliver it to the people who sought it out in the first place.
Yeah.
So how long had you guys been using MDID as your delivery solution?
So I think we started using it in maybe 2011.
Okay.
6 or 7 years, although over the past 2 or 3 years, we had not been importing that new Dimly data back into the system. So there's sort of a gap between what's represented in the data of MDID and our total collection in the Visual Resources Center, which is sort of better represented in Dimly's data.
Yeah, I feel like that sort of having to reconcile having two different versions of the data, like having to pick one to be the database of record and then bring that one so that it's as up to date and complete as possible, is sort of an inevitable cleanup step in any sort of migration. So was that something that you guys did locally, like reconciling until you got the actual version that you wanted to move, or was that something that Erin helped with?
It's a process that we started locally, just looking at trying to figure out what was represented in MDID. I will say that migrating MDID initially, and Erin can probably talk about this a little more from her end of the project, was a sort of stopgap measure to try to get the data into Forum and accessible to users as quickly as possible, although we ultimately would really like to get the better, rich Dimly data in there. But about, I would say maybe like 80% or so, maybe 90% of our total collection is pretty well represented in MDID. It's more of a factor of most of the records are there, but they're not as rich as the Dimly records are. So you get the basics of the data, but you don't get the really good relationships in MDID, of course. So we decided to just blanket migrate what was in MDID, as well as every image file that we had, and then try to do some quick exporting of newer items in Dimly, which was not as successful as I would have liked on our end because we had some issues with our exporting script. But yeah, so it's all of MDID and then a little bit from Dimly that was not already represented in MDID.
All right, and part of the goal there was to have access copies available for your students and staff in time for like the beginning of fall semester, right? That was another one of
correct.
That summer timeline really comes into play.
Yeah.
Okay, so then I kind of wanted to switch over to Erin, from your point of view, can you talk about sort of the high level phases that you as the migration manager saw this project having?
Yeah, and in actuality, I work with phases with all my migrations because it helps create a sense of the work to be accomplished within that span of time, and that span of time is usually something that is kind of discovered and discussed with the institution, so it's usually a case-by-case basis. But my phases usually run with phase one being just getting to know the data and getting to know the institution and the objectives and the workflows and everything that will hopefully become delivered by the end, and mapping the data in the fields to a project that can be built in Forum and collect everything that will be moving over. And so we start with the mapping, and usually I also build in what we call user acceptance testing, or UAT, if I go into shorthand. And it's just the review step for every phase where the institution checks the work, gives any feedback, applies any changes, and then when that part of the phase is reached, we know we're moving on to phase two, and we're transitioning our sites to the next portion, which second phase is usually the data had already been analyzed, but also cleaning up the data based on the analysis and prepping it for importing into Forum. And then we start with a small batch just to make sure that the fields are mapped as the institution would like, that the data is based on whatever needs have been asked, that it's being cleaned up in in the way that's intended and it's importing correctly. And so sometimes that might include checking that diacritics, for instance, are appearing correctly in forum, that everything is looking good before importing the remaining data, and then just double checking that at the end of phase 2. And then we go into phase 3, which is uploading the media, again, a chance to review and see how everything's looking, and publishing that out and making sure that final bit of mapping from forum into the end user published environment is also looking as intended, and continuing on with publishing the rest from there and signing off.
Yeah, can you give an example of some of the little cleanup projects that are common with this type of migration? Like when you were mentioning that you have to do some cleanup in the actual data, what are common issues that you see?
Yeah, so I'll preface that to say that I don't usually manipulate institutions' data. That's not my role. It's really more so just making sure that your data is going into forum cleanly, and that you're starting on a clean slate with all of this information, and it's not coming in with messy diacritics being the biggest one I found, especially from MDID, strangely enough. I'm on a second MDID migration with another institution. I found a common denominator between both, that the diacritics for some reason come out a bit scrambled. And so that's been a big cleanup project that I've now been able to, using this evidence, factor into the work involved and making sure it's an important component in making the migration happen successfully.
Yeah, that's a good example. And just so that to clarify for people who might not be familiar with the way that you sort of import data into forum, all of this cleanup and all of this review is happening in spreadsheet versions of the data at this point, right? You're just sort of working with a whole garden of spreadsheets.
Yeah, at this point, yeah, a lot of spreadsheet work. I've become far more proficient in Excel than I ever thought possible. But I think knowing this, there's definitely been discussions of how we can come up with a better mechanism to be far more efficient with cleaning up work like this, and not just diacritics, but other areas that might surface as I analyze the data, and as I become familiar with what the institution is presenting to me, and how we can just make it a much more effective and efficient solution for everyone.
Yeah, and when you've mentioned that you sort of do test imports and then you guys review them together, what sort of size are you talking about in terms of like how many records, how many images constitute like a test batch versus deciding to pull the trigger on just pulling in all of the data? Like, what are the chunks that you're working with?
From my perspective, it might vary by the institution and like the type of data that they have. Obviously, I would want to see kind of the gamut in terms of data that is there, whether it's your most robustly cataloged records and contain data in the most fields possible, compared to your records that might have a little bit less and might need a bit of some hand tooling to see how they both stack up against each other. Usually, people say gold records, but I think having the two sides of that coin are important to know, because there's always this aspect of post-migration work that I want to be visible early on, so we can talk about that and how like maybe I can help alleviate that post-migration work, and then also how you might strategize cleaning it up yourself. But I think in the case of Vanderbilt, I think we kind of used what Shelby found, because she knew the difference between MDID and DIMLY data and what would be best for the scenario. So I don't know if you'd want to speak to that.
Yeah, so since we're anticipating 2 migrations in the end, we sort of from the beginning said we're going to import all of this MDID data as well as we can initially, and then we're going to leave it alone. There was not a lot of sense in our minds in doing a ton of post-migration cleanup work on this data if we plan to basically replace it with the richer Dimly data in the future. That being said, we did do a little bit. There were about I think like 750 records that were very new that I had managed to export out of Dimly that we included in this migration, which I kind of wanted to use as my gold records for training faculty members. And those I did go through one by one post-migration and do some small corrections. There was an issue with the way that we were exporting records from Dimly back into MDID historically, where, and no one had noticed this for years, but the style period field was being overwritten with a duplicate of the culture field, which is not always easy to differentiate in certain records because often they're the same. It'll be Chinese and we don't know anything more specific about it. So the culture is Chinese, but so is the style period. But often they're different, or often they duplicate the culture field, but also include a second data bit or a third or whatever. So nobody had noticed that this was happening with the MDID migration for a long time, and it finally occurred to me when we exported things for this migration. So that is still an issue with the vast majority of the data, the MDID data that we have in Forum right now. So that field has been overwritten by another. Not that it necessarily is incorrect, you just lose a little bit of extra data, you know. So I did do a bit of correcting of that, of my sort of gold records after the migration, just so I could show off our best data to our faculty as I was training them. But that was the biggest cleanup thing that I found. Erin was very helpful. You know, we did have to correct the diacritics, and we had a librarian in the library help us with some XML transformations to make sure that everything was looking good before we sent it off to Erin. And then I worked with Erin a little bit trying to figure out how to parse out some fields that had been concatenated from the relational data when it got squished back into MDID. So there were some combined work image fields that we had to discuss how we were going to parse those out so that they would be easily differentiated in the new system.
Yeah, those all sound like the exact type of things that when you go to migrate, you discover all kinds of rich eccentricities in your data, for better or worse. And there's a question about this in the questions box that segues very nicely into one of my next questions for you guys, which was, what are sort of the numbers and the stats of this migration? Like how many records, how many images? What were all the totals when it was said and done?
I don't know if you have these handy, Shelby, but I pulled them from our last my last audit. So I can say them if you'd like.
Yeah, please go ahead. I just have ballpark figures off the top of my head.
So just so everyone else knows, when I do migrations, I always do audits throughout just to make sure that the numbers are also stacking up correctly. So I will do things like seeing how many data records have come through, how many images have been uploaded, and also the relationship of like how many images have properly synced up to data records and how many might be free floating, so that we know those numbers and I can present them to the institution to say, hey, let's talk about these. Do you know why this might be? How can we solve it before we close it? So the numbers that I got from my very last audit with Vanderbilt were, in terms of data records, there were 111,860 records. Images, there were 111,590. And we published 102,319 to their institutional collection on Artstor.
All right. And there's one of the things that I actually did want to point out here is, and I'm going to jump into the actual forum environment for Vanderbilt's collections, because Shelby, when you were mentioning before that you guys planned to migrate the MDID data and then kind of just not touch it and like move right along, one of the things that was implied there is that you've also got this second project now where you guys do all of your new original cataloging that has taken place since the migration, right? That's what this fall 2018 project is?
Yes, that's correct. And this is the data field setup is a little bit different from the MDID migration. I took my cues from the MDID migration, but also added some fields that I anticipated just knowing how much richer our Dimly records are, and also trying to anticipate how the Dimly data might be squished a little bit into Forum in the future. So overall, pretty similar. It's still based on VRA core, but with a few added pieces. For example, I'll point out at the very bottom there, you can see we added patron so that we could keep track of which faculty member was ordering these things. And then we just have a, oh, the word is escaping me, just a list of, like an authoritative list of possible faculty members as patrons for that field. And I think order is a new field as well. Because that was sort of implied in the structure of Dimly, but was not explicitly stated in each individual record previously, but that's something that we need to keep track of for our workflow.
Right. Yeah. So there are a couple of differences in terms of the actual schema that you're using now versus what is represented in the migrated MDID collection.
Yes. And I should point out, because I just saw you mouse over it, that our MDID migration collection, the fields for the 4 Artstor required fields are there, but because we're deciding not to do much with this data, they're not completed. So those aren't really usable in the Artstor, the published version of the records. But that is something that now in our new records, we are including those 4 Artstor fields.
Ah, okay, that makes sense. And for anybody who isn't familiar with sort of the relationship between forum projects and the Artstor environment, which is where this is being delivered now, I knew that was going to happen when I logged in before the session. So when you have a project that you are managing in Forum, so whether you've migrated one or if you're working with an ongoing project actively, when you go to publish records from these projects, you can establish target collections that appear in the Artstor environment under your institutional collections. And so that is where all of these Vanderbilt images are now being delivered. And this is where I grabbed this image from before. So you were seeing the actual view of the project in Forum, and then also the view that the end user encounters when they are browsing collections in Artstor. Which is sort of a nice segue, because I'm interested in, given that this collection, like this actual image library, was previously being delivered via MDID, what has the experience been so far this semester with making it available in Artstor instead?
Yeah, so this changed our delivery workflow a little bit, which was the part that I honestly was the most excited about. Because if faculty members have a preference for PowerPoints, then they can generate those directly in Artstor, and that's not something that we necessarily have to do for them within our workflow. So that was kind of exciting to me. So everything gets ingested, anything new is ingested into Forum. Most things are immediately, once cataloged, published to this repository that you see here, the institutional collection, which is available campus-wide. A few things, for example, you were just looking at a blank record in Forum, which was something I just today digitized. Yes, this record here. This is from the slide collection of one of our faculty members. These are photographs of Chinese architecture that she took. We have no idea what they are, so they're not cataloged right now. She's going to have to go in and catalog them herself because she has the subject knowledge. But I needed to get them pushed to publication so that she could at least see the images as quickly as possible. So part of our new delivery method is to not only publish things to the institutional collection, but also to publish things to a personal collection target for each faculty member. So these images are not available institutionally, but they are available for her when she logs into Artstor. She sees them in a personal collection too.
Right. And I actually discovered this by accident earlier when I noticed that the collections are linked from the data. So this is sort of an example of what the faculty members would see.
Yes.
It's like a selection of all of their specific item records.
Exactly. And so we have the source, the book that it came out of course, in the metadata and the order number in the metadata, so they can sort of search within their own personal collections for particular orders that they requested, which so far I think is working out really well. We have I think about 5 faculty members total have needed us to do new copy stain orders since we implemented this new workflow, and I certainly haven't heard any complaints. So I think it's going well, fingers crossed.
No, that's good, especially if the prior delivery method had been PowerPoints anyways. I feel like the ability in Artstor to download images and image groups to PowerPoint presentations directly is very convenient for them.
Yeah, and my hope is that it's sort of easier for them to manage what they have already ordered. Leonard Folgerate, whose collection of Frida Kahlo images we were just looking at, he's like in the weeds in this research, and because Dimly was so inaccessible to him, he wasn't always sure if he had ordered something before, and because he only had it in PowerPoint, it was hard for him to find to go back and look for images that he had already had digitized. So I'm hoping that this makes it a lot easier for our faculty members to go back and look for things that they maybe had digitized 6 months ago, a year ago, and not necessarily have to come through us and have us look for it again, or accidentally copy something and duplicate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I feel like that's one of the big headaches of these image libraries that sort of, people are adding to them over tens of years. You inevitably end up digitizing the same image twice or ending up with some duplication. And so anything that you can do in the description and delivery to minimize that, if only from the requester's end, is going to save you a lot of time and effort later in the process.
Exactly. I think the maximum I've seen is 6 copies of the same image between MDID and Dimly. So we're trying to minimize that.
Yeah, that's understandable. So one of the things that I am curious about just personally is, Erin, you were mentioning that sort of in this outline that I added here, which is obviously like a very simplified overview of the general process of the migration, I could have effectively added between each of these bullet points a UAT review phase, right, where you and Shelby would sort of review whatever work had been done, come to an agreement about whether or not it was good to move on to the next step, and then proceed. Logistically, how did those UAT conversations take place? Were they meetings, or did you have some kind of way of exchanging and reviewing content?
In this case, it was email exchanges. I would do an overview of everything that had been accomplished within the phase, and then a bit of some high-level instructions of what to look for, what I'm seeking in terms of feedback, and then anything else that you might see, for Shelby to take her time to go over it and get back to me with her comments. Of course, though, at the beginning when we first met in our first kickoff meeting, I take that time to establish communication preferences too, and if meetings at these UAT phases would be preferred, or if just communicating by email would suffice, and if on the fly we decided we needed to meet by phone, if we can always build that right in. So I tried to be as thorough as possible in the emails as well. I'm very verbose in my emails, which I do apologize in advance.
No, I will say that Erin was very thorough in her emails, and I thought that method of communication worked really well for us. It gave me a chance to review things before I responded to her, and she covered everything that she needed to. I think that it was very easy to communicate that way for this project. Once we got it rolling, I didn't feel like there were a ton of complications. Maybe you feel differently about it from your end, Erin, but once it got started, it felt pretty straightforward.
I feel the same. Getting off the ground obviously takes a lot of understanding on my part to become familiar with the data that you know very well. But once we did, it was pretty smooth sailing, and from my perspective as well.
Yeah, one of the things that I was thinking about in one of the examples you guys gave before, like Shelby, when you were mentioning that there had been this ongoing issue with the style period field being overwritten by culture, but that not necessarily being a conspicuous enough issue that you didn't notice it until this migration came up. That's the kind of observation that comes from knowing the data incredibly well. And I think one of the pieces of a migration project that people find really daunting is that when they're presented with the opportunity to do acceptance testing, like Erin, you build into the process, they almost don't know what they're looking for. And I'm wondering if either of you have any like high level tips for people who don't have a lot of experience or might not have like legacy knowledge of the collection. What are red flags that you can scan for when you're reviewing data for migration that you might not necessarily catch in the way that Shelby did with that one field?
Well, for me, that one field I finally caught just because it became extremely suspicious how often the culture and style period fields were the same. Like I said, that does happen pretty often, but it shouldn't be 100% of the time. Also,
so be wary of anything that seems too good to be true.
Yeah, exactly. Any really big gaps in the data, like if I kept looking at records and something was blank, that was obviously suspicious to me, that maybe some data had gotten dropped. I don't think that happened on a wide scale in this case, but that was something that I looked for. And I did a lot of one-to-one comparisons, or 1-to-2, I guess, of the record in how it was looking in Forum, and if it was in Dimly, and also in MDID, like looking at all three across the board and comparing them. And for me, it helped that I was also setting up a new project for new orders as we were doing this migration. So I was thinking very much about like, how is this data set up? What do I need to include in it? I need to make sure that I'm not missing some important field that we don't catalog for 6 months and then realize later on that we needed the entire time. So it helped to be doing those two things simultaneously, both reviewing existing records and trying to set up a new project.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think the ability to, in Forum, you can have multiple projects that publish into the same target in the Artstor environment, and the ability to compartmentalize the migrated data versus the data that's being newly created is also a really good exercise in kind of looking back and forth between each of those and keeping the needs of each data set in mind. So I think that was probably a really smart move on your guys' part as you were going through this process.
I think
it was super useful to me to be able to compartmentalize those things.
I think also to your point about comparing back to the original system is very important, because that's something I don't have access to and I can't verify as easily. So
that's a good point, Erin.
Yeah, taking those records and just double checking them against their sources is really smart to do as well.
Yeah, so it's like, I guess some of the takeaways there were scan for things that are identical or blank when they shouldn't necessarily be, spot checking individual items. From like the actual data value perspective, Erin, you've mentioned diacritics a couple of times. Is that something people should pay a special attention to when they're exporting content?
Definitely. That is something that I learned from this experience. So that is another takeaway. I would highly recommend paying attention to diacritics. And if the frequency of diacritics too, at which you're cataloging, you may not be using it as often, so it may not matter. But if your catalogers are applying diacritics, see how they export and how they translate to Excel.
Yeah, I have a sort of adjacent horror story about diacritics, which is that for some complicated reasons that I don't totally understand, we have a subset of legacy records that needed to be copy cataloged by hand into Dimly, and that data had come from MDID or possibly some other source, and they were in spreadsheets. And it turns out that whatever migration had occurred had dropped. Anytime there was a diacritical mark in a line of data, it would drop the remainder of the data after that mark. So if something was like, this happened a lot with the French museums. So you know, Musée d'Orsay, you would get like MUSE, and then it would be gone, the rest of the field. Because that
no.
second E with the diacritical mark would just totally drop the rest of the field. So that took us a really long time to notice, actually, because you would see some data, but you wouldn't see all of the data, so you didn't necessarily know how much of it was missing. So yeah, be careful with diacritics.
Oh man, that's the kind of thing that also, like, if you're just scanning spreadsheet versions of your data, it's super easy to miss that because you usually only see the beginning, like, left anchored text anyways. So if the issue
Absolutely.
falls with the second half of the field, it's like you might never even see that. And
Yeah.
ignorance is bliss. That is sort of a nightmare.
Yeah.
There was a question actually about the copyright for the images in this collection, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to comment on that, Shelby, because so the question is, how was copyright handled for legacy slides where origin wasn't properly documented?
Yeah, so this is a big issue for us, and this actually was a bit of a sticking point. I think Ken is on this call and he can attest to this. I'm not speaking, but I think he's listening in. This was a big issue for our network security team at Vanderbilt. They were extremely worried about all of these high resolution images going into a system that they weren't familiar with, and would people outside of the institution have access to it? I mean, they were frankly paranoid about it. And so we went back and forth a number of times trying to explain to them, like, this will only be accessible to Vanderbilt affiliated users. And they're not, I will point out that what we decided to upload are high resolution, but they are JPEGs and not our archival TIFFs. So we keep our archival TIFFs backed up separately from this. So, but yeah, so this is mostly a slide collection that's been developed over decades. And we don't, I mean, we know the book source maybe half of the time, 50% of the time, but sometimes we don't know anything about it. We might know like who ordered it or what course number it was ordered for, but often we don't have a lot of information about it. And just because, you know, of course, just because we have the source information doesn't mean we really know who owns the copyright for this particular image. So yeah, so we have to be very careful that this does not become more widely available, because it frankly will take a lot of manual labor for us to look through each one of these images and try to track down copyright information for it. Like I said, about 60% of our total collection are licensed images from Archivision, which makes it a little bit easier because we know exactly where those came from. We bought the license for them, so we're more comfortable with those. But that still leaves, you know, probably about 50,000 records that we probably only have really good copyright data for a fraction of it, 10%, 15%. Yeah, so that's a big concern for us. But they are primarily used for teaching. So
right. And so that's what I was gonna chime in and say, like, that's also, first of all, a really common issue, especially with types of collections. And in this case, one of the things that you'll notice as I'm browsing around here is that I keep going to this browse and clicking institutional collections. And this means that the collection as Vanderbilt has published it is only visible to Vanderbilt authenticated users. So even though like within Forum, you can designate different collection targets that have that are accessible by different sort of ranges of users. And this one is limited to your institutional audience, which allows you to pretty safely stay within the bounds of fair use because it's all for teaching and research.
Yeah, and we include a copyright notice in the records, which Forum gives you the option to do. Yeah. And like I said, like, we in the History of Art department understood that this would be fine, and this was within the bounds of fair use, and we were protecting it well enough and doing due diligence. It's just for some reason Vanderbilt's network security team was a little alarmed by it.
They were, yeah. I remember that call. It was they were thorough.
Yeah.
So then there's also a question here that I just wanted to address because we are coming up sort of near the end of the session. And I don't remember if I said this explicitly at the outset, but if you have any questions for Erin or Shelby, you can just submit them in the questions box that's in that GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll see them and we'll get to them hopefully before the end of the session. So there was another one here that is asking about the 8 hours of consultative services that are included with a forum subscription, and whether this sort of migration work falls within the scope of those complimentary 8 hours. And I just wanted to specify that this project was a separate migration service that Vanderbilt paid for. Those 8 hours can be used for a wide range of things, and we can sort of elaborate on that after the session. But in this case, because of the amount of work that was going to go into this migration, it was a separately purchased service.
Yeah, and if I can add that the 8 hours of consultative services for an implementation as a new subscriber doesn't apply to doing estimates or discussing, potential migration services, since that is outside of the scope of what we would do in consulting you and achieving a workflow design or objective within a call. So yeah, we try to differentiate as best as possible there.
Yeah, and those 8 hours are, what am I trying to say? Oh, they're different from our support. So every forum subscriber has unlimited support. So when you write in or have login issues or something like that, all of that is unlimited. The 8 hours are really designed for people who are just getting started with a new forum subscription and who might have questions about how to design your project and get going. We do a lot of tailored training. And so it's really geared more at people who are coming in and starting fresh, whereas these migration projects are handled a little bit differently because, like I said at the outset, every migration is its own unique snowflake, and there can be a wider variety of circumstances. And there's one more question that's asking Shelby about why you guys didn't use MDID's interface to give faculty access to images. But I think you did. That was your delivery mechanism prior to Forum and Artstor.
It was.
Right? Yeah.
And it worked to a certain extent, although it never really built up the use that I think the department wanted. And so part of the decision was a staff member was interested in developing a new system, and part of it was that we wanted richer cataloging. So we were using MDID 2, and it's pretty sort of limited in scope and what you can, the types of fields you can catalog, and we wanted to start using linked open data and Getty authorities and things like that. So we decided to develop a new system, and that new system just never really worked out from the end user.
Yeah, and that was dimly.
Yes. Yeah.
And so I guess that's sort of a nice segue into overall, why did you guys go with Forum and Artstor as your management and delivery combination rather than some other system?
We shopped around a little bit and had some faculty input from several faculty members who were sort of the most invested in moving to a new system away from Dimly. And I think the big benefit to them was the idea that they could search our repository alongside the other collections available in Artstor. I think that's awesome. I mean, I love that we can do that. So you can run a search and you'll pull both our institutional collections and everything else that's available with our standard subscription to Artstor. And so for them, that was great because they could create image groups and PowerPoints that combined things that they had digitized in-house and also stuff that they already knew existed in Artstor.
Yeah, that commingling is incredibly convenient, especially if you already have people that are using Artstor on your campus.
Yes, and so most of our faculty were already using Artstor, so that was an easy transition for them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right, so we are right at time, and I'm not seeing any more questions that are unanswered at this point. If they sneak in under the wire, I'll try and get to them. But I wanted to wrap up and first of all say thank you so much to Shelby and Erin for doing this and having this conversation. I think this is very helpful. And like I said, I hope anyone who is on the line and staring down a migration project at least feels like they have heard a little bit more and have some more data points to work with as they move forward. In terms of follow-ups, there will be a recording of this webinar that will be available after the fact, and anybody who registered will receive an email with a link to it. So feel free to pass it along to anyone you know who couldn't be here today. And I think that's all that we had to cover. Do you guys have any sort of parting thoughts?
I don't, other than to say thank you for hosting, Hannah.
Sure, my pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to say that, you know, there's a lot of new people to this whole forum world that it looks like have registered and attended. So there will be follow-up to see if you're interested in learning more about migration services. And we would love to learn more about your objectives in potentially migrating. So you'll be hearing from us soon.
Yeah, absolutely.
And thank you, Hannah and Shelby, for conversing with me.
Thanks.
All right. I think that's it. So thanks so much for attending, and we are going to wrap it up. Have a good day, everybody.